At my husband's funeral, I realized my family had already decided I was worth nothing, and the strangest part was, I let them believe it. The morning air was crisp, the kind that settles into your bones and makes everything feel a little too quiet, a little too final. And as I stepped out of the black sedan in front of St. Andrew's Church, I smoothed the front of my dress the way I always did when I needed to steady myself. A simple navy dress. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw attention, because today wasn't supposed to be about appearances. It was supposed to be about honoring the man I had spent 42 years of my life with. But the moment I reached the entrance, I knew something was off, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the subtle absence of warmth, the kind you only notice when you've spent a lifetime being surrounded by it, and suddenly it's gone. No one greeted me at the door. No one stepped forward to take my hand or offer a quiet word of comfort. And for a brief second I wondered if I had arrived at the wrong time. But the low hum of conversation drifting from inside told me otherwise. So I walked in alone, my heels echoing softly against the polished floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The church was already filled, rows of black suits and muted dresses, heads bowed in conversation. But as I scanned the room, I realized something else. There was no seat saved for me at the front, not beside the casket where a wife would normally sit, not even in the first few rows, and I paused just long enough for the realization to settle before I moved quietly toward the back, choosing an empty seat near the aisle, as if I were just another distant relative who had come out of obligation, rather than loss. I folded my hands in my lap and stared ahead, my eyes tracing the outline of the closed casket, the polished wood reflecting the soft light from the stained glass windows. And for a moment, I let myself remember the man inside, the way he used to laugh at his own jokes, the way he would reach for my hand without thinking, the way he always made sure I was taken care of. And then I heard it, a voice just a few rows ahead, low but not low enough. "I mean, let's be honest," Ashley said, her tone carrying that familiar edge of casual cruelty she disguised as honesty. She never really contributed much financially. Robert handled everything. There was a soft murmur of agreement, followed by a quiet chuckle, and I didn't need to see her face to know the expression she was wearing, that slight tilt of the head, the faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. I kept my gaze forward, my expression unchanged, because reacting would have given her exactly what she wanted, and I had no intention of doing that. Not today, not ever again. The service began shortly after, the organ filling the space with a slow, solemn melody, and one by one, people stood to speak, sharing stories, memories, fragments of a life that had touched so many others. But as I listened, I noticed something else, something that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. But to me, it was impossible to ignore. No one mentioned me, not once, not as his wife, not as his partner. Not as the person who had stood beside him through every success and every setback. It was as if I had been carefully edited out of the narrative, erased with the same quiet precision they used to move me to the back row. I felt a shift inside me then, not a surge of anger or grief, but something colder, something clearer, like a lens snapping into focus after being slightly off for far too long. When the service ended, people began to gather in small clusters, offering condolences, sharing polite smiles, and I stood slowly, smoothing my dress again out of habit, before making my way toward the exit. But I didn't get far before Daniel's voice stopped me. "Mom," he said, his tone neutral, almost distracted, as if this were just another errand he needed to take care of. And when I turned to face him, I noticed the way his eyes flicked briefly over my outfit, assessing, calculating. "We're heading to the reception," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the parking lot. "You can ride with someone if you need to. If you need to. Not we'll go together. Not I'll make sure you're okay. Just a casual suggestion, an afterthought," and I nodded slightly, because correcting him would have required an explanation, and I wasn't ready to give them that. Not yet. Ashley appeared beside him then, her expression composed, sympathetic in the way people learn to be when they know others are watching, and she reached out to touch my arm briefly, her fingers light, almost perfunctory. "We've made some arrangements," she said, her voice soft but firm, "just to make things easier moving forward." I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to see the flicker of something beneath the surface, anticipation, maybe even a hint of satisfaction, and I smiled. a small, controlled smile that revealed nothing. "I'm sure you have," I replied quietly, my voice steady, my posture relaxed. Because the truth was, I already knew exactly what they thought. They believed I was dependent, that I had been living off my husband's success without understanding it, that without him, I would be lost, vulnerable, easy to manage, and for a long time, I had allowed that perception to exist, partly out of habit, partly out of convenience. But standing there in the aftermath of a funeral where I had been reduced to a footnote in my own marriage, I realized something else entirely. Sometimes the most powerful position you can hold is the one no one sees coming. And as I walked past them, stepping out into the cool afternoon light, I made a quiet decision. I would let them keep believing their version of me, because the truth, the real truth, was worth $28 million, and I hadn't mentioned a single cent. I did not go to the reception with them. Instead, I walked slowly to my car, my hand resting on the door handle a moment longer than necessary, as if I needed that extra second to separate the woman they believed I was from the woman I actually had become. And once I was inside, I closed the door gently, shutting out the distant murmur of voices and the soft hum of engines starting, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to exhale fully. The drive home was quiet, the road stretching ahead in a familiar line. Every turn and stoplight mapped into my memory after decades of routine, but the house I returned to felt different, not empty, but altered, as if something invisible had shifted beneath the surface. I set my keys down on the small wooden table by the door, the same table Robert had insisted on buying during a weekend trip years ago, and I stood there for a moment, listening, half expecting to hear his footsteps or the faint sound of the television in the den, but there was only silence, steady and unbroken. I walked into the living room, my eyes moving over the furniture, the framed photographs, the small details that once felt permanent, and I realized that everything around me still held the same value it always had. It was the people who had changed. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor, and I moved slowly through the space, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, taking note of everything, grounding myself in the reality that this house, this life, was not something that could be quietly taken from me just because someone else believed it could. I made my way to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady, my movements deliberate, and as I stood there, I replayed the conversations I had overheard, the tone of Ashley's voice, the absence of my name, the casual way Daniel had distanced himself, and piece by piece, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This was not a sudden shift brought on by grief or confusion. It had been building for some time, hidden beneath polite smiles and carefully chosen words, and I had allowed it to go unnoticed because it was easier to believe in the version of my family that I had spent years protecting. I set the glass down and walked down the hallway toward Robert's study, a room that had always been his domain, though he never locked the door, never felt the need to, and when I stepped inside, the familiar scent of his cologne lingered faintly in the air, a quiet reminder of the life we had built together. His desk was exactly as he had left it, papers neatly stacked, a pen resting beside a closed folder, everything in its place, as if he might walk in at any moment and pick up where he left off, but I knew better than to hold on to that illusion. I moved closer, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the desk, and then I opened the top drawer, not searching blindly, but with purpose, because I already knew what was inside. The folder was still there, thick, unassuming, its contents far more significant than its appearance suggested, and I lifted it carefully, placing it on the desk before opening it. The documents inside were crisp, organized, each page a quiet confirmation of what Robert and I had planned long before any of this unfolded. And as I scanned the familiar lines, the numbers stood out clearly, precise and undeniable. A figure that most people would not believe unless they saw it for themselves. A figure that explained everything they had overlooked, everything they had misunderstood. $28 million, structured, protected, and entirely separate from the accounts Daniel believed he would inherit without question. I closed the folder slowly, my expression unchanged, because this was not a moment of surprise for me. It was a moment of clarity. Robert had not been careless, and neither had I. We had simply been quiet about it, choosing discretion over display, privacy over validation, and in doing so, We had allowed others to form their own conclusions that now worked entirely in my favor. I returned the folder to the drawer and closed it gently, the soft click echoing slightly in the stillness of the room, and I stood there for a moment, considering my next steps, not with urgency, but with precision. They believed I was dependent, that I would rely on them for guidance, for support, for decisions that they had already begun to make on my behalf, and that belief would shape everything they did next, every conversation, every plan, every assumption. I turned off the light in the study and walked back into the hallway, the house settling into its usual quiet around me. And as I reached the living room, my phone buzzed softly on the table where I had left it. I glanced at the screen, seeing Daniel's name, and let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of control. "Mom," he said, his voice measured, almost rehearsed. "We need to talk about some things, practical things, about the house, about finances, about what comes next." I listened without interrupting, my gaze resting on the window as the light outside began to fade. And when he finished, waiting for my response, I allowed a small pause to settle between us. "Of course," I said finally, my tone calm, agreeable, exactly what he expected to hear, because sometimes the most effective way to understand someone's intentions is to give them the space to reveal them fully. I ended the call shortly after, placing the phone back on the table, and for a moment, I simply stood there, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like a familiar presence. But this time, it did not feel empty. It felt steady, grounded, and entirely mine. They were already making plans, already positioning themselves as if the outcome were certain. But certainty can be a dangerous thing when it is built on incomplete information. And as I moved toward the kitchen, turning off the last of the lights for the evening, I understood something with absolute clarity. They were preparing to take control of a situation they did not fully understand, and I was going to let them. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to move more carefully around me. And I woke before the sun had fully risen, lying still for a moment as I listened to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second marking the beginning of something new, whether I was ready for it or not. And when I finally got up, I followed the same routine I had followed for years, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the early light spill into the kitchen. But this time, every movement felt different, not heavier, just more intentional, as if I were seeing my own life from a slight distance for the first time. I sat at the table with my cup in both hands, the warmth grounding me, and I let my thoughts settle into place, not scattered or emotional, but organized, precise, like pieces of a puzzle that had finally started to align. They would come today, I was certain of that, not out of concern, but out of necessity, because people like Ashley did not wait long when they believed there was something to secure, and Daniel, for all his hesitation, had already chosen his side, not out of malice, but out of convenience, and that made him even more predictable. By mid-morning, the house was exactly as I wanted it, not rearranged or staged, just maintained, everything in its place, the kind of quiet order that does not draw attention to itself. And when the doorbell rang, it did not startle me. I simply set my cup down, stood up, and walked to the door with the same calm I had carried since the night before. Ashley stood there first, her posture straight, her expression carefully composed into something that resembled sympathy, and Daniel hovered just behind her, his shoulders slightly tense, his eyes searching my face for something he could not quite name, and I opened the door without hesitation, stepping back to let them in as if this were any other visit, any other day. "We did not want you to be alone," Ashley said as she stepped inside, her voice soft, measured, every word placed exactly where she wanted it. And I nodded once, offering a small smile that revealed nothing, because there was no need to challenge her version of concern, not when it served my purpose to let her believe it. Daniel followed her into the living room, glancing around briefly, as if assessing the space in a way that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with value. And I noticed it, the subtle shift in his attention, the way his gaze lingered on certain details, and I said nothing, because observation had become far more useful than reaction. We sat down, the three of us forming a quiet triangle of polite distance, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal who would break it first, and of course, it was Ashley. We have been thinking about what comes next, she began, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her tone calm, almost reassuring, about what would be best for everyone, especially you. And there it was, the careful framing, the suggestion that everything she was about to say was for my benefit, not theirs, and I inclined my head slightly, as if encouraging her to continue. This house, she went on, her eyes moving briefly around the room before returning to me. It is a lot to manage on your own, and with everything that has happened, we just want to make sure you are not overwhelmed. And I could see Daniel nod beside her, his agreement quiet but present, his role in this conversation clearly defined, support, not leadership. I let a small pause settle before responding, not out of uncertainty, but to give her words the space she expected them to fill, and then I spoke, my voice even, measured, exactly as it had been the day before. I appreciate your concern, I said, and I meant it, not for the reasons she assumed, but because concern, real or not, always revealed something about the person offering it. Ashley smiled slightly, encouraged, and leaned forward just enough to suggest engagement without appearing aggressive. We were thinking, she continued, that it might make sense to start simplifying things, maybe look into selling the house, moving you somewhere more manageable, somewhere closer to us. And there it was, the proposal delivered with the kind of careful softness that often disguises something far more calculated. I looked at her, really looked this time, not just at her expression, but at the certainty behind it, the quiet confidence that came from believing the outcome was already decided, and I felt something shift again, not in my emotions, but in my understanding of just how far they were willing to go. Daniel cleared his throat then, adding his voice to hers. It is just temporary, Mom. Until everything settles, we can help handle the finances, make sure everything is taken care of. And I turned my gaze to him, holding it just long enough for him to feel seen, really seen, before I nodded slowly, as if considering his words with genuine thought. That sounds reasonable, I said, my tone soft, agreeable, the exact response they had been hoping for, and I watched as a flicker of relief passed between them, subtle but unmistakable, a shared confirmation that their plan was unfolding exactly as expected. But what they did not see, what they could not see, was that every word they spoke, every assumption they made, was giving me something far more valuable than control. It was giving me clarity, and as I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, I understood that this conversation was not about decisions, it was about timing. And I had no intention of rushing something they were so eager to believe they already owned. They stayed longer than necessary, not out of care, but out of strategy. I could see it in the way Ashley lingered in her seat, even after the conversation had reached its natural end, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her handbag as if she were waiting for one more opportunity to guide the direction. And Daniel, sitting beside her, seemed caught between habit and hesitation, his posture slightly forward, as though he wanted to say something else, but could not quite find the right words. And I allowed the silence to stretch just enough to make them uncomfortable, because silence has a way of revealing what words try to hide. Eventually, Ashley stood first, smoothing her coat with a small, practiced motion, her expression settling back into that familiar version of concern that never quite touched her eyes. "We will start looking into options," she said gently, as if the decision had already been made, as if I had already agreed to something far more permanent than I actually had, and I nodded once, offering the same calm acceptance I had given her all morning, because correcting her now would have served no purpose, not when she was so willing to continue under her own assumptions. Daniel followed her lead, standing a moment later, his gaze lingering on me briefly, searching again for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps confirmation, but I gave him neither. Only a quiet smile that could be interpreted in any way he needed it to be. "We will come by later this week," he added, his voice softer now, less certain, "to go over everything in more detail." And I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his words without committing to anything beyond the moment, because commitment, like information, is something best given with intention. I walked them to the door, my steps measured, my posture relaxed, and when Ashley stepped outside, she turned back just long enough to offer one final look, the kind that carries more meaning than words, a silent assurance to herself that everything was moving exactly as planned, and I returned that look with the same composed stillness, because there is a certain power in being underestimated, a power that grows stronger the longer it goes unchallenged. When the door closed behind them, the house settled back into its quiet rhythm, the faint echo of their presence fading almost immediately, and I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the door, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if I were marking the transition from one phase to another. I turned and walked back into the living room, my gaze moving over the space with a renewed clarity, every object, every detail, carrying a sense of ownership that no conversation could diminish. And I realized then that what they had come for was not just the house or the finances. It was control, the quiet authority to decide what happened next. And they believed they could claim it simply by stepping into the space I had occupied for decades. I moved to the window and looked out at the street, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the pavement, and for a moment, I allowed myself to consider the version of events they had already begun to construct, a version where I would gradually step aside, where decisions would be made on my behalf, where my role would be reduced to something smaller, quieter, easier to manage, and I almost admired the simplicity of it, the way it relied so heavily on the assumption that I would not question it. But assumptions, I had learned, are rarely built on anything solid, and the more confident they become, the more fragile they tend to be. I stepped away from the window and walked down the hallway once more, my footsteps steady, my thoughts focused, and when I reached the study, I did not hesitate this time. I went directly to the desk, opened the drawer, and took out the folder again, not because I needed to confirm what was inside, but because holding it in my hands served as a reminder of what was real and what was merely perceived. I opened it slowly, my eyes moving over the documents with the same calm attention, each page reinforcing the quiet truth that had been carefully preserved, untouched by the opinions or expectations of anyone else. And as I reached the final page, I allowed myself a small pause, my fingers resting lightly against the paper, before closing the folder once more. They believed they were preparing me for change, guiding me toward decisions that would simplify my life. But what they did not understand was that the simplicity they offered came at the cost of something far greater, autonomy. And that was not something I had any intention of surrendering. I returned the folder to its place and closed the drawer, the soft click echoing slightly in the stillness of the room. And then I reached for the phone on the desk, my movements deliberate, my mind already several steps ahead. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for, one I had not needed to use in quite some time. And when I pressed call, I did not feel hesitation, only clarity. The line rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered, steady, professional, unchanged by time. "Mr. Collins," I said, my tone calm, composed, "I believe it is time we reviewed everything." And as I listened to his response, I felt that quiet sense of alignment settle into place once more, the kind that comes when intention and action finally meet. Because while they were busy preparing their version of the future, I was preparing mine, and the difference between the two was not just perspective, it was knowledge, and knowledge, when used correctly, has a way of changing everything. Mr. Collins did not ask unnecessary questions, and that was one of the reasons Robert had trusted him for so many years. He simply listened, the way professionals do when they already understand more than they need to say. And when I finished speaking, there was a brief pause on the line, not hesitation, but acknowledgement. "I was wondering when you would call," he said calmly, his voice steady, unchanged by the weight of the situation, and I could almost picture him in his office, surrounded by files that held more truth than most families ever openly discuss. "Are you available this afternoon?" I asked, my tone even, as if this were any ordinary appointment, because in many ways, that is exactly what it needed to be, not dramatic, not reactive, just precise. "I will make the time," he replied without delay, and that was all I needed to hear. By early afternoon, I was on my way to his office, the drive familiar but different now, each mile carrying a quiet sense of direction that had nothing to do with location and everything to do with intention. And when I arrived, the building stood exactly as it always had, understated, professional, the kind of place that does not attract attention but holds significant decisions within its walls. Mr. Collins greeted me personally, meeting me just inside the entrance with a slight nod and a look that carried more understanding than sympathy. And as we walked into his office, I noticed that nothing had changed, not the arrangement of the furniture, not the framed certificates on the wall, not even the faint scent of polished wood that lingered in the air. Everything remained consistent, reliable, unaffected by the shifting dynamics of a single family. I took my seat across from him, placing my handbag neatly beside the chair, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence serving its purpose as a transition between what had been and what was about to be clarified. He reached for a file on his desk, not hurriedly, not dramatically, just with the kind of deliberate movement that suggests preparation rather than reaction. And when he opened it, I recognized the documents immediately, not because I needed to see them again, but because I understood what they represented. "Your husband was very thorough," he said, his eyes briefly meeting mine before returning to the pages in front of him, and I nodded slightly, because thoroughness had always been one of Robert's defining traits, not just in business, but in life, in the way he planned, in the way he protected what mattered to him. "Everything is structured exactly as he intended," Mr. Collins continued, his voice calm, factual. "The accounts, the assets, the distributions, there is no ambiguity." And that word, ambiguity, lingered for a moment, because it was precisely what Daniel and Ashley were relying on, the assumption that there was room for interpretation, for influence, for control. I folded my hands in my lap, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged, and I listened as he outlined the details, not because I needed to learn them again, but because hearing them spoken aloud reinforced their certainty. Each figure, each clause, each condition forming a structure that was far more solid than anything built on assumption. "The 28 million, he said finally, his tone no different from when he mentioned any other number, "is entirely under your control, with specific protections in place to ensure that control cannot be transferred or influenced without your explicit consent." And I allowed a small pause to follow, not out of surprise, but out of recognition, because this was the foundation of everything that would come next. "And Daniel?" I asked, my voice steady, not emotional, just precise, because clarity requires direct questions. Mr. Collins adjusted the file slightly, his gaze focused. "Your son is named in the will," he said, "but his access is limited, structured over time, with conditions tied to specific decisions, including the sale of this house." And there it was, the detail that mattered most, not just the existence of the assets, but the control over how they could be accessed, how they could be used, how they could be delayed. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my thoughts aligning with a clarity that felt almost inevitable now, because everything they had assumed, everything they had planned, depended on a version of reality that simply did not exist. "They believe they can make decisions for me," I said quietly, not as a complaint, but as an observation, and Mr. Collins met my gaze with a look that held no judgment, only understanding. "That belief is not uncommon," he replied, "especially when information is incomplete." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was accurate in a way that simplified everything. Incomplete information, that was what they were working with, and incomplete information leads to incomplete strategies, and incomplete strategies have a way of unraveling when they are tested. We spent the next hour reviewing every detail, not rushing, not skipping anything, because precision matters when the stakes are this high, and by the time we finished, there was no uncertainty left, only decisions waiting to be made. As I stood to leave, Mr. Collins closed the file and looked at me once more, his expression calm, professional, but with a hint of something else beneath it, respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You have more control than they realize," he said simply, and I nodded, because that was no longer something I needed to confirm. It was something I understood completely. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon light felt different, not brighter, not warmer, just clearer, as if the world itself had come into sharper focus. And as I walked to my car, I realized that the next time Daniel and Ashley sat across from me, they would be continuing a conversation they believed they understood, but I would be the one deciding how it ended. And I had no intention of correcting their assumptions until the moment it mattered most. When I returned home, I did not turn on the television or reach for any distractions. I simply placed my keys on the table and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Because now the silence felt different. It was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I controlled, and that distinction mattered more than anything Daniel or Ashley could say. I moved through the house slowly, not out of uncertainty, but with a deliberate awareness of every step, every object, every space that had been quietly dismissed as something temporary in their minds. And I realized that what they saw as something to manage, I saw as something already secured. The evening light stretched across the floor in long, steady lines, and I paused by the window again, watching as a car passed by. Then another, ordinary movements in a world that continued exactly as it always had, unaffected by the assumptions being made inside this house. My phone buzzed shortly after, a soft vibration against the wood, and I glanced at the screen without rushing, seeing Ashley's name this time, not Daniel's, which told me everything I needed to know about who was leading the next move. I let it ring once, twice, before answering, not to create distance, but to establish it. "We have been talking," she began without preamble, her tone polite but direct, the softness still there but thinner now, as if it required more effort to maintain. "And we think it would be best to move forward quickly, before things become more complicated." And I could almost hear Daniel in the background, not speaking, but present, a silent confirmation of her words. I walked into the living room as she spoke, my gaze moving over the same familiar details, the framed photograph on the shelf, the chair Robert used to sit in, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her to lay out the version of urgency she had constructed. "There are buyers who would be interested in a property like this," she continued. "And if we act now, we can make sure you are in a much better position long-term." And there it was again, the careful framing, the suggestion that everything she proposed was for my benefit, when in reality, it revealed exactly how much she believed she could guide the outcome. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, my movements calm, controlled, and when she paused, waiting for my response, I gave her exactly what she expected, nothing more, nothing less. "That sounds like a lot to consider," I said, my voice even, thoughtful, the kind of response that invites further explanation without offering resistance. And I could almost feel the shift on the other end of the line, the subtle increase in confidence, the quiet belief that the path ahead was becoming easier to shape. "We can handle most of it," she added quickly, her tone brightening slightly. "The paperwork, the negotiations, all of it, so you do not have to worry." And I let a small pause follow, just long enough to acknowledge her offer without fully accepting it, because acceptance, like everything else, is something that carries weight when used carefully. "I appreciate that," I replied, and I meant it in the same way I appreciated clarity, because every word she spoke confirmed the direction they were moving, and the more they revealed, the more precise my own response could become. After we ended the call, I set the phone down gently and leaned back in the chair, my eyes resting on the ceiling for a moment as I let the conversation settle into place, not emotionally, but strategically, because what they were doing now was no longer subtle. It was structured, intentional, and based entirely on the belief that I would follow the path they laid out. I stood after a moment and walked back to the study, not out of habit this time, but with purpose, and when I opened the drawer and looked at the folder again, I did not feel the need to read it. I already knew what it contained, what it represented, what it protected, and more importantly, what it allowed me to do. I closed the drawer and turned away, my mind already moving ahead, considering timing, sequence, the order in which information should be revealed, because control is not just about what you know, it is about when you choose to let others know it. They were accelerating, pushing for decisions, creating a sense of urgency that did not actually exist, and that urgency would become their weakness, because the faster they moved, the more they would expose, the more they would commit to a version of events that could not hold. I walked back into the living room and turned off the lights one by one, the house settling into a quiet darkness that felt steady, contained, entirely mine. And as I made my way upstairs, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed they were guiding me toward a conclusion, but in reality, they were walking directly into a position I had already prepared. And the only thing left to decide was how long I would allow them to keep believing they were in control. 2 days later, they returned, not with hesitation, but with purpose, and I could see at the moment I opened the door, the subtle shift in their posture, the quiet confidence that had grown stronger since our last conversation, as if the absence of resistance had convinced them that Everything was already falling into place. Ashley walked in first again, her movements smooth, controlled, her expression carefully arranged into something between concern and efficiency, and Daniel followed, carrying a folder this time, his grip slightly tighter than necessary, as though holding on to something that made him feel more certain of his role in what was about to happen. I stepped aside and let them enter without comment, my silence now something they had grown accustomed to, something they had begun to interpret as agreement rather than observation. We gathered in the living room once more, the same seats, the same arrangement, but the atmosphere had changed. There was less hesitation now, less careful phrasing, and more direction in the way Ashley spoke when she finally began. "We have made some progress," she said, placing a thin stack of papers on the table between us, her tone steady, assured. "We spoke to a real estate agent, and there is already interest in the property." And she slid the papers slightly toward me, not pushing, just enough to suggest expectation. I glanced down briefly, not to read, but to acknowledge, and then I looked back up at her, my expression unchanged, my attention steady. "That was fast," I said quietly, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, not doubt, but calculation, as if she were adjusting her next move based on the tone I had chosen. "The market is active," she replied smoothly, "and homes like this do not stay available for long, especially in this neighborhood." And Daniel nodded beside her, his voice joining hers a moment later. "It is a good opportunity, Mom," he added, his tone measured, rehearsed. "We just want to make sure you are taken care of before anything becomes complicated." And there it was again, that word, complicated, used as a justification for urgency, as if time itself were something that could turn against me if I did not act quickly enough. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and I let a small pause settle into the space between us, long enough for them to feel it, to wonder, to anticipate, because anticipation has a way of making people reveal more than they intend. "And what exactly would that look like?" I asked finally, my voice even, curious, inviting them to explain their plan in full rather than leaving it implied, and Ashley did not hesitate. "We would list the house within the week," she said, her words clear, direct, "handle the negotiations, finalize the sale, and then help you transition into something smaller, more manageable, closer to us." And as she spoke, I watched the way she held herself, the certainty in her tone, the quiet belief that this was not just a suggestion, but a solution already accepted. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, opening the folder he had brought, revealing more documents, more numbers, more structure, and he turned it toward me as if presenting something official, something that required acknowledgement. "We have already started outlining the financial steps," he said, his voice steadier now, strengthened by the presence of paperwork, "just to make things easier for you." And I looked at the pages, not reading them, not reacting, simply observing the effort, the preparation, the assumption that ease was something they could define on my behalf. I nodded once, slowly, deliberately, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, waiting, watching, expecting a response that would move everything forward exactly as they had planned, and I gave them what they expected, just not in the way they understood. "It sounds like you have put a lot of thought into this," I said calmly, my tone measured, acknowledging their effort without accepting their conclusion, and I saw it then, that small, almost imperceptible exchange between them, a glance, a shift, a silent confirmation that they were on the right path, that their approach was working. But what they did not realize, what they could not see, was that every step they took, every decision they made without full understanding, was not bringing them closer to control. It was bringing them closer to a point where that control would be tested. And as I sat there, listening, watching, allowing them to continue, I understood that they were no longer just making assumptions, they were building on them. And structures built that way have a tendency to collapse the moment they meet something real. I did not reach for the papers Daniel had placed in front of me, and that, more than anything, seemed to shift the air in the room, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone watching from a distance, but enough for Ashley's fingers to pause slightly against the edge of the table, enough for Daniel to adjust his posture as if he suddenly was not entirely certain where this conversation was heading. I let the silence stretch again, not to create tension, but to allow their expectations to settle into something more defined. Because once expectations take shape, they are easier to see, easier to understand, and far easier to dismantle when the time comes. You should at least take a look, Daniel said after a moment, his voice steady but with a trace of something beneath it, not impatience, not yet, but something close, and I turned my gaze to him slowly, meeting his eyes with the same calm I had maintained since they arrived. I will, I replied, my tone measured, not dismissive, not committed, just enough to move the conversation forward without giving it direction, and that seemed to satisfy him, at least for now. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her attention focused, her presence more active than before, and I could see the subtle shift in her approach, the way she was recalibrating, adjusting her tone, her pacing, her choice of words. "We are just trying to make this easier for you," she said again, softer this time, more personal, as if repetition might reinforce the sincerity of the statement, and I inclined my head just enough to acknowledge it, because acknowledgement, like everything else, can be given without agreement. "I understand," I said quietly, and I did, not in the way she intended, but in a way that made everything clearer with each passing moment. I reached for the papers then, not because I needed to read them, but because timing matters, and I knew that picking them up now would confirm what they already believed, that I was following their lead, that I was stepping into the role they had quietly assigned to me. I turned a page slowly, my eyes moving across the lines without absorbing them, because the details they had prepared were not the details that mattered, and after a moment, I set the papers back down with the same calm precision. "You have done a lot of work," I said, my voice even, and I watched as that same flicker of validation passed between them, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that comes when effort is recognized, even if it is not yet accepted. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly," Daniel added, his confidence returning, reinforced by my willingness to engage, and Ashley nodded beside him, her expression softening slightly, as if the outcome was now only a matter of time. I let another pause settle, shorter this time, controlled, intentional, and then I shifted slightly in my seat, not away from them, but into a position that allowed me to look at both of them clearly, without turning, without adjusting, just a small change that carried more weight than it appeared to. "There is something we should do first," I said, my tone calm, steady, and for the first time since they arrived, they did not immediately respond, because this was not part of the structure they had prepared, not part of the sequence they expected. Ashley's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, and Daniel's hand remained resting on the folder, as if waiting for instruction that had not yet been given. "What do you mean?" he asked finally, his voice measured, but no longer entirely certain. I held their gaze for a moment, not long enough to create discomfort, but long enough to establish that what I was about to say was not a reaction, not an objection, but a decision. "Before anything moves forward," I continued, my words slow, deliberate, "we should sit down with Mr. Collins and review everything together." And there it was, simple, reasonable, impossible to dismiss without revealing something they would rather keep hidden. For a brief second, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, I saw it, the first real fracture in their certainty, not a collapse, not yet, but a shift, a moment where the structure they had built encountered something solid, something they had not accounted for. Ashley was the first to recover, her expression smoothing over, her posture adjusting back into control, but the delay had already said more than her response ever could. "Of course," she said, her tone even, but not as fluid as before. "If that makes you more comfortable," and I nodded once, because comfort was not the reason, but it was the explanation she needed to accept. Daniel glanced at her briefly, then back at me, his expression more guarded now, more attentive, as if he were reassessing something he had previously taken for granted, and I recognized that look, not from him, but from Robert, from years of watching him evaluate situations that did not unfold the way he expected. "We can arrange that," Daniel said finally, his voice steady again, but quieter, more cautious, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his response without adding anything further, because the conversation had already shifted, the direction had already changed, and there was no need to push it any further than necessary. They stayed a little while longer, but the energy was different now, less certain, less controlled, and when they finally stood to leave, Their movements were just slightly more measured, their expressions just slightly more reserved, as if something small but significant had moved beneath the surface. I walked them to the door as I always did, my posture relaxed, my tone polite, and when Ashley stepped outside, she turned back once more, but this time, the look she gave me was not one of quiet confidence. It was something else, something closer to calculation, as if she were trying to understand a variable she had not considered before. I returned her gaze with the same calm stillness, because there was nothing for me to explain, nothing for me to clarify, not yet, and as the door closed behind them, I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood, aware of the shift that had just taken place, not loud, not dramatic, but real, and once again, I had not needed to raise my voice or reveal anything they were not ready to see. I had simply adjusted the timing, and sometimes that is all it takes to change everything. The meeting with Mr. Collins was set for the following afternoon, and when the time came, I arrived a few minutes early, not out of habit, but because I wanted to be there before them, to settle into the space, to establish a presence that could not be quietly adjusted once they walked in. The office was the same as it had been before, calm, structured, unaffected by the shifting expectations that had begun to form around it. And when I took my seat across from Mr. Collins, I noticed the way he glanced briefly at the door, aware that this time, the conversation would not be limited to just the two of us. Daniel and Ashley arrived together, their timing precise, their expressions composed. But there was a difference now, something subtle but unmistakable, a carefulness that had not been there before, as if they were stepping into a space where the outcome was no longer entirely within their control. Ashley greeted Mr. Collins first, her tone polite, professional, her posture straight, while Daniel followed with a quieter acknowledgement, his attention already shifting between the file on the desk and my expression, as if trying to anticipate what might unfold. We all took our seats, the arrangement deliberate, balanced, no one positioned at the head, no one placed above the others, and for a moment, the room held a silence that was not empty, but expectant. Mr. Collins began without delay, his voice steady, measured, the kind that does not need to assert authority because it already carries it. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his gaze moving briefly from one person to the next before settling on the file in front of him, and then he opened it, the soft sound of paper shifting marking the beginning of something that could not be easily redirected. "I understand there have been discussions about the property and the overall estate," he continued, his tone neutral, factual, and Ashley nodded slightly, her expression composed, her confidence returning in small, controlled increments. "We just want to make sure everything is handled efficiently," she said, her words careful, her voice even, and Daniel added a quiet agreement, his posture leaning forward just enough to signal engagement without overstepping. Mr. Collins acknowledged them with a slight nod, and then he turned a page, his attention returning fully to the documents. And when he spoke again, his words were not framed as suggestions or opinions, they were statements, clear, precise, and grounded in fact. "The property," he said, "is solely under Margaret's ownership, and any decision regarding its sale requires her direct authorization." And I watched as the words settled, not dramatically, not with immediate reaction, but with a subtle shift in the air, the kind that occurs when expectation meets something solid. Ashley's posture remained steady, but her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her notebook, a small detail, easy to miss, but impossible to ignore once seen, and Daniel's gaze moved briefly toward me, then back to Mr. Collins, as if recalibrating his understanding in real time. "Of course," Ashley said after a moment, her tone smooth, controlled. "We are here to support whatever is best." And I said nothing, because support, as she defined it, had already been made clear. Mr. Collins continued, turning another page, his voice unchanged. "In addition, the primary financial accounts, including those totaling $28 million, are structured in a way that places full control with Margaret. And this time, the reaction was not delayed, not entirely. Daniel's expression shifted first, not dramatically, but enough for the change to register, his posture stiffening slightly, his focus sharpening, while Ashley remained still for a fraction of a second longer before adjusting, her composure holding, but with more effort now, more intention. "I was not aware of that," Daniel said finally, His voice measured, but quieter than before, and Mr. Collins nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "That is correct," he replied, his tone even. The structure was designed to ensure clarity and independence, and I allowed a small pause to follow, not to emphasize the statement, but to let it settle fully, to give it the space it required to be understood. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her attention more focused now, her earlier confidence reshaped into something more analytical. "And how does that affect the overall distribution?" she asked, her voice controlled, professional, but no longer leading, no longer guiding, and Mr. Collins responded with the same clarity he had maintained from the beginning, outlining the conditions, the limitations, the structure that had been carefully put in place long before this conversation ever occurred. I listened without interruption, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required presence, and as the details unfolded, I could see it, the gradual shift, the recalibration, the quiet realization that the foundation they had been building on was not what they believed it to be. When Mr. Collins finished, the room settled into a different kind of silence, not expectant this time, but reflective, and Daniel looked at me again, his expression no longer searching, but processing, while Ashley sat back slightly, her posture still composed, but her certainty no longer as absolute. I met their gaze calmly, offering nothing more than a quiet acknowledgement of what had just been made clear, because there was no need to explain, no need to assert. The facts had already done that on my behalf, and as I gathered my things and stood, I understood that the conversation they had come prepared to lead had shifted entirely, not because I had challenged them, but because I had allowed the truth to speak at the exact moment it mattered most. And sometimes, that is all it takes to remind people that control is not something you assume, it is something you either have or you do not. And now, finally, they understood which side of that line they were standing on.